The whole platform went quiet when Agnes Kettering stepped down from the coach, and not the kind of quiet that spoke well of her. She felt the silence settle over Cottonwood crossing like a held breath. Felt every eye on the platform move from her plain brown travelling dress to her unremarkable face to the modest single trunk the porter set down beside her, and she had lived long enough with that particular silence to know exactly what it meant. Somewhere behind her, a woman's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry, murmured to a companion that surely there had been some mistake, that a man as fine as Weston Granger could not possibly have sent for a bride so plain. Agnes had heard variations of that judgment her whole life in Ohio, where her own mother had once sighed over her lack of the family's good looks, in the boarding house where she'd worked 3 years mending linens for women prettier and better courted than she, in every parlor where she'd sat quietly while sisters and cousins collected suitors like ribbons. She lifted her chin now the way she had learned to lift it 100 times before, and did not let the murmuring women see that it had landed anywhere close to her heart. "Miss Kettering?" The voice belonged to a tall man crossing the platform with an unhurried, purposeful stride, his hat in his hand, his eyes finding hers directly rather than sliding away in the polite disappointment she had braced herself for. "Weston Granger, I believe we've corresponded." "We have," Agnes said, and found she could not read his expression at all, which unsettled her more than open disapproval would have. "I understand I may not be quite what the town expected, Mr. Granger. I'll not hold it against you if you'd rather I take the next coach back." Something flickered across his face, not disappointment, she realized with cautious surprise, but something closer to irritation on her behalf. "The town expected nothing," he said. "The town gossips because there's little better to occupy it. I expected a woman who wrote me the most sensible, thoughtful letters I've received in 3 years of running this ranch, and unless I'm very much mistaken, that's exactly who's standing in front of me." It was not the response Agnes had prepared for, and she did not entirely trust it yet. He drove her out to the small house he'd had readied for her arrival himself, rather than sending a hired man, and pointed out landmarks along the way with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere better to be: the church, the schoolhouse, the bend in the creek where his own father had first staked the rancher's claim 30 years back. Agnes found herself relaxing by degrees, the tight knot of dread she'd carried since the depot loosening under the plain, undemanding courtesy of a man who seemed entirely unbothered by whatever the town whispered behind them. "You wrote that you'd spent 3 years mending linens in a boarding house," Weston said, as the wagon rolled past the last of the town's buildings. "That's fine work, but it's not the life I imagine you dreamed of as a girl." "I dreamed of a great many things as a girl," Agnes said. "Most of them stopped mattering once I understood how the world sorts women into pretty and plain, and treats the second sort as though they ought to be grateful for whatever scraps of notice come their way. I stopped dreaming and started managing instead. It serves a person better, in my experience." "It sounds a lonely way to live," Weston said, quietly enough that she suspected he hadn't meant to say it aloud. "It was," Agnes admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I don't say that for your pity, Mr. Granger. Only because you asked plainly, and I find I prefer to answer plainly in kind." "Weston," he said, "if we're to be married inside the month, you may as well use my name." She tried it, tentative, and found she liked the shape of it in her mouth a good deal more than she expected to. The trouble, as it turned out, had a name and a face of its own: Valain Ashcombe, a rancher's widowed daughter who had made no secret, in the weeks before Agnes's arrival, that she considered herself the more fitting match for Cottonwood Crossing's wealthiest cattleman. Valain was lovely in the accepted way, golden-haired, quick-tongued, always dressed a season ahead of the county's fashion, and she made it particular pleasure, in the days that followed Agnes's arrival, to ensure the whole town understood exactly how poor a bargain Weston Granger had made. "I do hope you're prepared for ranch life, Miss Kettering," Valain said one afternoon at the Mercantile, her smile sharp as a blade beneath its politeness. "It takes a certain presence to manage a household of Mr. Granger's standing. I'd hate to see you overwhelmed by expectations you weren't quite built for." "I've managed households a good deal harder than his, Miss Ashcombe," Agnes said evenly, "with a good deal less presence than you seem to require for the task." She did not raise her voice, did not flush. only paid for her thread and left the mercantile with her dignity fully intact, though her hands trembled faintly with the effort of it once she was out of sight. Weston heard of the exchange within the day, as he seemed to hear of most things concerning Agnes within the day, and found her that evening mending a torn hem on the porch of the small house he'd had prepared for her. Valain Ashcombe has spent 3 years deciding I owe her a courtship I never once offered her, he said, settling onto the step beside her, close enough that she caught the scent of leather and wood smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere. I'd apologize for the town's rudeness, Agnes, but I suspect you'd rather I simply say what I think plainly instead. I'd rather that, yes. Then I'll say it plainly. I courted a pretty woman once years back, before I built any of this. He gestured a small motion at the ranch house and the pastures beyond. She left the moment a wealthier man made her a better offer, and it taught me the particular worthlessness of choosing a wife by what pleases a room at first glance. Your letters showed me a mind I respected before I ever saw your face, Agnes Kettering, and nothing the town or Valain Ashcombe says is going to change what I already decided before that coach ever pulled in. Agnes set down her mending, her throat tight with an emotion she did not immediately have a name for. You hardly know me well enough to have decided anything at all. I know you well enough to know you didn't flinch from Valain today, and you haven't flinched once since you stepped off that coach into a town that decided to judge you before you'd said a single word, Weston said. That tells me plenty, Agnes. More than a pretty face ever could. She did not entirely believe him, not yet. Old doubts, worn smooth by years of comparison, did not dissolve in a single conversation on a porch step. But something in his steadiness, the plain unhurried way he looked at her without ever once glancing toward prettier distractions, began working loose the tight, guarded place in her chest, where she had long ago packed away any hope of being chosen first. Valain did not concede the field easily. She called on Agnes twice more that week, each visit dressed in the pretense of neighborly welcome and each one laced with small, precise cruelties. A comment on the plainness of Agnes's furnishings, a wondering aloud whether Agnes had ever attended a proper ball. A gentle suggestion that Weston's affections, however currently directed, had a way of wandering toward more suitable company given time. Agnes bore each visit with the same even composure she'd shown at the mercantile, though she confided to no one, not even Weston, how deeply each small barb still landed in the old, tender places Valain seemed to know exactly how to find. You mustn't let her trouble you, old Mrs. Purdy, the minister's wife, told her one afternoon, having witnessed the tail end of one such visit. Valain Ashcombe has spent 3 years courting a man who never once courted her back. It's a bitter thing, watching someone else win what you'd already decided belonged to you. I don't feel as though I've won anything yet, Agnes admitted. I feel as though I'm waiting for the town to decide I don't belong here after all. Then give them time to decide otherwise, Mrs. Purdy said. This county's opinion turns slower than a loaded wagon deer, but it does turn given cause. The town's welcome social, held at the Grange Hall the following Saturday, was meant to formally introduce Weston's new bride to Cottonwood Crossing and Valain Ashcombe. Agnes understood within moments of arriving, had arranged the evening's seating and dancing with the precision of a woman intent on one final humiliation before conceding defeat. Agnes found herself seated at the edge of the hall, largely ignored, while Valain claimed the first 3 dances with Weston through a series of maneuvers too smooth to openly object to. Agnes watched from her chair at the edge of the hall as Valain spun past on Weston's arm, golden hair catching the lamplight, and felt every old wound of her girlhood open fresh, the sister who'd always been asked first, the cousin who'd never once had to sit watching from the wall. She told herself it did not matter, that Weston had chosen her already, plainly and repeatedly, but sitting alone while the town's loveliest woman claimed dance after dance from her intended husband tested that certainty more sorely than she cared to admit. It was during the 4th dance, with the hall crowded and the fiddle music at its height, that the trouble began outside. A team of horses hitched near the Grange Hall spooked at a firecracker some careless boy had set off in the street, and bolted with the wagon still attached, careening straight toward the crowd of children who had gathered by the hall's open doors to watch the dancing through the windows. The screams that went up inside the hall seemed to reach Agnes half a second before her mind fully understood the danger, the the fiddle music screeching to a stop, chairs overturning as the crowd surged backward from the doors. Agnes, seated closest to the entrance, was on her feet and moving before she had fully registered the danger, her mind fixed on nothing but the small frozen shape of a child too frightened to run. She caught up little Sari Dunmore, no more than 4 years old, standing paralyzed directly in the wagon's path, and hauled her clear into the ditch beside the road, just as the runaway team thundered past close enough that the wind of it tore at Agnes's skirts and flung grit stinging against her cheek. For one endless heartbeat, she felt the ground itself shudder beneath the pounding hooves, certain the wagon's wheel would catch them both, before the danger tore past and left only its terrible echo ringing in her ears. The wagon crashed into the hitching rail a dozen yards further on, splintering wood and scattering the crowd's shocked cries into the night, but no one was hurt beyond a few bruises among those who'd scrambled clear in time. Agnes sat in the ditch with Sari sobbing in her arms, her own hands shaking now that the danger had passed, and looked up to find half the town staring at her with an expression entirely unlike the cool assessment she'd grown used to. The hall emptied out into the street in an instant. A dozen voices calling Sari's name, but it was Weston who reached the ditch first, shoving through the crowd with a speed that startled even those who thought they knew him, dropping to his knees in the dirt beside her, his face gone pale with a fear that had nothing to do with propriety. Agnes. Agnes, are you hurt? I'm well, she said, though her voice shook. Sari's well too, just frightened. You could have been killed, he said, gathering them both against him without a moment's regard for the watching crowd. Running straight into a bolting team's path. Agnes, you didn't even hesitate. There wasn't time to hesitate, she said simply. There was only time to move. Her hands had not stopped trembling, but her voice held steady, and she found she did not much mind, for once, being the center of the whole town's undivided attention. The town of Cottonwood Crossing, which had spent 2 weeks measuring Agnes Kettering against Valain Ashcombe's polished beauty and finding her wanting, spent the following days measuring her instead against the plain, unflinching courage of a woman who had not stopped to consider her own safety before saving a child from a runaway wagon. Sari Dunmore's mother wept openly, thanking her at church the following Sunday. The mercantile owner's wife, who had once eyed Agnes's plain dress with faint pity, now greeted her by name and asked after her health with genuine warmth. Even Valain Ashcombe, cornered by her own conscience, or perhaps simply outmaneuvered by public opinion, offered a stiff but sincere word of admiration before retreating from the field entirely. You've done in a fortnight what I couldn't manage in 3 years of trying to impress this town, Weston told her, the week after the accident, standing with her in the golden late afternoon light of the ranch yard. Though I confess, Agnes, I'd already chosen you long before the town came around. I only wish you'd believed it sooner. I believe a great many things sooner when they're proven rather than merely spoken, Agnes said, though the words came gentler now than her old guardedness would have allowed. You chose me at the depot at Weston, before I'd done anything at all to earn it. That took me longer to trust than I care to admit. Then let me say it again, so there's no mistaking it, Weston said, and took both her hands in his, steady and sure. I didn't choose you because the town approved, and I didn't choose you because you proved yourself brave enough to satisfy their doubts. I chose you because you were exactly the woman I'd been looking for the whole while, plain dress and unremarkable face, and all the courage this county has ever seen packed inside one letter-writing heart. The rest was only Cottonwood Crossing catching up to what I already knew. Agnes Kettering, who had spent a lifetime being measured and found wanting beside prettier, louder women, looked at the cattleman who had chosen her first and never once wavered, and found she finally believed him completely. They married that autumn in the very Grange Hall where Valain Ashcombe had once arranged her humiliation, the whole town turning out to celebrate a match no one dared call unfitting any longer. Sari Dunmore, scrubbed and solemn in a new pinafore, walked the aisle scattering wildflowers ahead of the bride, and her mother wept openly through the entire ceremony, as did more than a few of the women who had once murmured doubts on the depot platform. Valain Ashcombe attended, seated near the back, and offered Agnes a stiff but genuine curtsy on her way out, which Agnes accepted with the same plain grace she had carried through every trial the town had set before her. When Weston Granger lifted his new wife's hand to speak his vows, His voice carried clear and certain to every corner of the hall, unhurried as it had been from the very first moment on the depot platform, and Agnes thought that every plain, overlooked year of her life had simply been the long road leading her here. To a man who had seen her worth before the world ever thought to look, and to a town that had finally, belatedly, learned to see it too,